Aquaculture today sits at the center of one of the most important global conversations: how we produce more nutritious food while reducing environmental impact. As the world looks to aquaculture to help feed a growing population, the discussion around feed sustainability and responsible sourcing has never been so important. And when we talk about feed, we inevitably come to marine ingredients, fish meal and fish oil, which have played a foundational role in aquaculture nutrition for decades. For countries like India, which is now one of the world's leading seafood producers and exporters, these conversations are now becoming more critical. As the industry grows, so do the expectations around sustainability, traceability, emissions, and responsible feed systems. And to help us unpack these questions, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Brett Glencross, Technical Director at International Fish Meal and Fish Oil Organization. Brett brings decades of experience in aquaculture, nutrition, and feed science. Before joining IFO in 2021, he was professor of aquaculture nutrition at the Institute of Aquaculture at the University of Stirling and earlier held senior research roles with CSIRO. His work spans fish and shrimp nutrition, feed ingredient innovation, and sustainability science, making him one of the leading voices in how aquaculture feeds are evolving globally. Brett, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Glad to join you, Richa.
Great. So, to begin with the podcast, Brett, could you please tell us a little bit about your journey into aquaculture nutrition and the work you're currently leading at IFO?
Okay, so if I go back about 30 years ago, I finished a degree at the University of Western Australia in the early 1990s, triple major in biochemistry, molecular biology, and zoology. And then I went on to do an honours degree in biochemistry, and then I did a master's degree in pig physiology and nutrition, and then I did a PhD in shrimp nutrition. And from after I finished my PhD, I then worked in the tuna farming industry, tuna aquaculture industry, in South Australia. So I did my PhD in Queensland, my undergraduate in Western Australia, moved from Queensland after my PhD to South Australia to work in the tuna farming industry, and then came back to Western Australia around about the year 2000 to work with the provincial or the state government there, principally working on developing applications for grains. West Australia is the largest grain producing region of Australia. So it produces lots of wheat, barley, lupins, rapeseed, and we're developing applications for those crop products in aquaculture feeds. And I also started then about that same time developing or work on developing the Asian sea bass, the barramundi farming industry in Western Australia as well. So a lot of that was sustainability work on developing environmental monitoring and management plans, but also that feed story came into that equation as well. Did that for about 10 years, then went to the private sector, working with a fishing aquaculture company where we were looking to develop some aquaculture production. And then while I was there, I got approached by the CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, to go and lead their national feed research initiatives for Australia. So I moved from Western Australia back to Queensland again in about the year 2009, I think it was. And then I worked there for about 6 or 7 years, and then I left to CSIRO to work in the feed industry. I became a technical manager at Australia's largest feed company, Ridley Agri Products. And while I was working there, the job opportunity to work in the UK came up. And so about 10 years ago now, I applied for that role and got offered that role at the University of Stirling and emigrated from Australia to the not so warm climates of Scotland, where I've been living ever since. And then about 5 years ago now, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, I got approached by IFO to undertake their role as technical director for the global marine ingredients industry. And it sort of followed on because while I was a professor of nutrition at Stirling, I was running several projects for the industry anyway, both with industry companies directly as a consultant, but also running projects for IFO in terms of some of the overarching quality and sustainability questions that were affecting the industry. So I was sort of a known quantity to the industry in that regard. And that sort of brings me to where I am now.
Oh, great, great, Brett. I mean, I'm now more excited. Actually, look forward to taking this podcast further. So, Brett, when it comes to IFO promotes responsible and sustainable development of marine ingredients, right? So, I would like to know more about the members you have and how many countries you have reached out. What is your focus areas, focus countries, and when was it formed?
Well, start with the last one. That our main mission is to really support the responsible development of marine ingredients globally. But you have to remember we're a membership organization, so we're funded by our members for our members. We receive no other funding from any government or any other international source other than our membership. And our membership basically comprises the main producing companies around the world. But they also have to go through a vetting process. We have to basically, you can only become a member if it's approved by other members. So it is, we deliberately try and keep it elite to a certain degree, so we can maintain a certain degree of pressure over the responsibility that our members represent. So our main members represent places like Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, as an example. The UK has some members as well. There's other members throughout Europe, but the other and probably the largest countries by volume of production and numbers of members, probably Latin America. So places like Peru and Chile, who are among the world's biggest producers of marine ingredients. And of course, we also have some members in India too. But one of the key criteria for being a member of IFO is that is the ability to follow basically certain codes of conduct with respect to membership. And part of that is actually ensuring that your production is only coming from responsible fisheries. And there's different views on how we view that, but a lot of it's underpinned by the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fishing, the CCRF. And we work very closely with organisations like FAO, as an example. We're a trusted advisor to the FAO, as we are to their sister organisation, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and we sort of hold observer status for both of those UN organisations as well.
Hmm. So, if I can ask you, how about the members that belongs from India? Like you said that members are largely the fish meal and fish oil producers, right?
Yeah, because we have about 250 members in the IFO family. About half of them, or probably about a third of those, about 80 to 90, I think, are actually producers. So the majority of the members are actually not companies who make fish meal or fish oil. There might be traders, there might be feed companies, there might be equipment suppliers, so on. Or there might be oil refineries, for example, like people who buy fish oil and refine it for human consumption. So we, the IFO membership really covers the whole supply chain with respect to the marine ingredient story. And that's why it's quite particularly effective in being a voice for this sector, is because we can sort of see it from the productions, the origins of the production of the material right through to its application and use at the other end. It's a feed or a food ingredient. Increasingly, it's important to notice that the fastest growing sector for things, particularly like fish oil, it's not the feed sector, it's actually food. I mean, aquaculture globally is using less fish oil in feed now than it did 20 years ago. It's using more in food than it does. Well, it still uses more in aquaculture than it does in food, but the food sector is the fastest growing sector, and it's the most valuable sector.
Yes. Okay. So, Brett, now let me just talk a little bit about the global fish meal production and set the
Mhm.
context. So, if we look at the global fish meal production, it has stayed around 5 million tons per year, and fish oil roughly at 1 million tons per year. And this has been static for 30 years, right? And meanwhile, we have seen an explosion in aquaculture growth, and it now supplies 50% of global seafood. And that share is expected to increase to 62% by 2030. Right? So, if I talk about this in numbers, we are producing 94 million tons today, and it is expected to increase to more than 111 million tons by 2032. So, my question goes to you that since fish meal and fish oil has remained static, inclusion levels also have reduced from 25% to 10%, simply because demand outpaced supply. So, in this context, how fish meal and fish oil plans to stay relevant?
Many different ways. I mean, it's probably also worth mentioning it that about 10, 20 years ago, production was around about 5 million, 1 million tons. It's actually grown, particularly in the last 5, 6 years, by about 10%. So average production now is closer to 5.5 million tons for fish meal and about 1.2 million tons, 1.3 million tons for fish oil. And that's grown largely on the back of not wild capture production, but on the better reclamation and utilization of the circular economy products from fisheries. So, you rightly pointed out that aquaculture is now about 94 million tons of production. It's about 54% plus of the world's global production, which means there's about 85, 90 million tons of global production, which is fishery resources. And of that fishery resources, that 90 million tons, about 15 to 16 million tons is fish that's used directly for fish meal, which means you've got another 75 million tons, which is fish that is going for human consumption. But the thing about fish is that typically a fish is 50% meat and 50% not meat, things which are byproducts. So of that 75 million tons, arguably we eat around about, let's round up, say, 40 million tons of meat, meaning there's, 35 million tons of waste products that we could actually valorize. And presently we're valorizing probably around about 8 to 10 million tons of that 35 million tons. So there's still a lot more fish waste out there that we could be actively pursuing to retain its value. I mean, the worst thing you can do with this stuff is bury it or burn it. I mean, it's such a high value, nutritious product that you don't want to waste anything. So there's certainly more potential in that space. But to go back to your other question about, well, how does that change over time? As you rightly pointed out, 20 years, 25 years ago now, at the turn of the century, we were producing about 15 million tons of aquaculture feeds, of which was about 25% marine ingredients. These days, we're producing about 50, 55 million tons of aqua feeds, of which less than 10% is marine ingredients. And it's what an important number there to think about is that people say, oh, yeah, but we're using less and less fish meal. No, we're not. We're actually using more fish meal and fish oil now in aqua feeds than we ever have before. The total volume used has gone up from about 3.5 million tons to over 5 million tons now. But the relative inclusion has gone down simply because, well, scale. We're operating, as you pointed out early, that we're operating from a relatively fixed resource base. We can't expand it. So what happens is we're increasingly withdrawing from markets that can't afford to pay the premium price for the high grade resource that marine ingredients provide. So they then increasingly go towards niche markets or strategic applications, and they might be things like starter feeds, weaning feeds, feeds for high value species. Typically what you always see in the commodity markets, whether it's wheat, rice, soybean, or marine ingredients, is the market with the greatest purchasing capacity takes the largest share of the resource. That's just the way the capitalist system, economic system works. And so what we're increasingly seeing is markets like carp and tilapia uh, have dropped their utilization of marine ingredients out. Tilapia still uses marine ingredients, for example, but it's in the starter feed. So when the animals first start feeding onto an exogenous or a pelleted feed, they put a little bit of fish meal in there to encourage the fish to actually come on and eat the feed. But for grow out feeds in tilapia, they don't use anything at all. Um, Other species, though, are things like, say, for example, eel and turtle are good examples in China. They are still predominant. Fish meal still makes up the major ingredient in the feeds for those two species in China. And it's probably worth noting that China literally buys half of the world's production of fish meal these days. So literally, 1 out of every 2 parts of fish meal produced on the planet is now consumed in China, because they see this as a crucial strategic ingredient in their feed arsenal, really, in their feed raw material basket. And part of the reason for that is that you can supply basic nutrients, amino acids, energy, protein, lipids, and so on from a wide range of materials. But sometimes the amino acid balance is not quite right. Sometimes the palatability story is not quite right. So you can make a feed mostly out of wheat and soybean, for example, for say tilapia or shrimp. But then to actually make the animal want to eat the feed, you then need to put something on it on that in that feed that the animal finds attractive. And that's where marine ingredients come into the story. The composition of marine ingredients is highly palatable, and we know it actually acts as quite a strong feed incitant and feed attractant to encourage animals to eat. And that's been known for a long time. I mean, one of the main reasons why the pig industry used to use a lot of fish meal was because for that reason, to encourage piglets to transition from being milk feeding onto feeding onto pellets. It was the same story about that attraction story. So that's sort of where I see the marine ingredient story going. It's going to increasingly go towards those high value niche markets, where they play a strategic role rather than a bulk nutrient role.
So, Brett, since the supply is capped, right? Is it correct to say that during all these years, feed mills had to look out for other ingredients that may give them options that helps them decrease dependence on fish meal and fish oil on one hand, and at the same time helps them meet the same nutritional properties, mostly soybean meal, wheat, corn, etc., that provide volume nutrition.
I mean, the reality is all feed mills, the ones that are being intelligent about it, that you're always looking for other feed ingredients. And the analogy I often use here is a bit like if you're an investor and you're investing your hard-earned money into say shares and stocks, you don't put all your money into one company. That's pretty dumb approach. What you need to do is actually have what we call a diversified portfolio where you actually spread your risk across a range of different stocks and shares. And the feed industry is the same in that you don't want to have all your feeds made from 1 or 2 ingredients, because then you expose yourself to supply, quality, and price risk quite substantially. But by having a diversified raw material basket, we talk about a basket being the range of different ingredients you might have available in the factory. You can actually keep your options open, and when prices or qualities or supplies change, you can switch things in and out a little bit. It's also important to note that the feed formulation process, in contrast to say cooking, if you and I would cook, say, an Indian curry or a Thai curry or a cake or something, we formulate that or we make that by getting certain ingredients and putting it into the recipe at certain ratios to make what we want to make. Okay. Formulating feeds isn't that process. Formulating feeds looks at the composition of the ingredients, and then it uses a mathematical process to work out what is the optimum combination of the ingredients you have available to actually achieve a blend that achieves a certain compositional outcome at the other end. And it does that process by what's called a linear least cost formulation process. So there's an overriding pressure on that process to make the cost of doing that as low as possible. Now, to do that, what you need to know is the price of every ingredient you have in your feed basket, but also you need to know the composition of every parameter that you want to formulate to. such that when you formulate a feed to say certain nutritional targets, it might be proteins, lysine, energy, whatever, and then you need to know that same information in every single ingredient you have in your raw material basket in your factory. And then when you formulate to it, it will tell you what this is the cheapest option with these ingredients to achieve this nutritional outcome. Now, that's just a simple mathematical process, and basically by optimizing the composition of multiple ingredients to achieve a standardized composition of a particular combination of those ingredients in the form of a feed. But then you might have to override that by putting in what we call caveats. And the caveats basically are where you force things in at a minimum level or a maximum level. For example, you might say, I don't want any more than 25% soybean in my feed. So you put 25% as an upper threshold that cannot be crossed for a particular ingredient. In this case, you say soybean. Or you might say, I want to make sure I have at least 5% fish meal in my formulation. So you put a minimum caveat in there to force that ingredient in. And then the whole process recalculates again with a maximum threshold and a minimum thresholds as you have pre-imposed. And you can do that process every time you formulate a different feed for every species, every size class within species, and so on. And every month, when you buy new raw materials, when the prices change or your supplies change, you redo that formulation process again and again and again. And that allows you to switch ingredients in and out, because what you learn through that process is ingredients per se are not important. They're just vehicles for nutrients. Nutrients are what makes the formulation and what actually makes animals perform. But as I said, the ingredients are the carriers of those nutrients. So you have to work with them and understand the ingredients to enable you to understand that formulation process.
Like if we think of it like yeast in bread, you use a tiny amount, right? But without it, the system doesn't work properly.
Correct. Yeah. So that's,
So
but even within baking, like making bread, you're typically looking at flour, a bit of oil, or wheat flour, a bit of oil, and yeast to get it to rise. So it is still very much, we say, recipe driven. You're looking at the ratios of the different ingredients. You're not really worried about what's the protein content, what's the starch content, what's the fat content, and am I trying to manage that to be consistent in that bread? From when we make bread, we don't really care about that so much. It's more based upon that recipe process, which is handed down over time. Whereas formulation is a mathematical process underpinned by scientific targets that we're trying to achieve, irrespective of the ingredients we work. I mean, we can switch in soybean and rapeseed and wheat and corn and fish meal and move these things around and actually make the same composition, but with different ingredients coming into play, depending upon what our targets are and what our supplies are.
yeah,
And that's sort of what's happened over the last 25 years, is as we've learnt in particular to work with grain products, corn, wheat, soybeans, other oil seeds, rice, as we've learnt to work with those ingredients and what aquatic species can use and cannot use, we've learnt to better understand how to formulate feeds with them as our key resources in that feed formulation arsenal. So what that typically means now, if you look at a formulation, we look at that 55 million tons globally, of which we make for aquaculture feeds, I'd say somewhere between probably 45 and 50 million tons of that is now grain products. And, I don't see that changing anytime soon, really, because, I mean, you look at global production of grain products, there's about 4 billion tons. It's the scale is just mind blowing. I mean, total global fish production, there's aquaculture and fisheries combined, is only about 185 million tons. I'm talking 4 billion tons for grains. We're literally like less than 5% of that. So within that 4 billion tons, what you also find is that about 40% of it's used as feed. We actually use more of the global grain production that we grow. We're obviously got all this land that we cultivate to grow grains. We use more of those grains we cultivate for animal feed than we do for food. For example, corn, which is the world's largest single species crop. We use most of that, about 90% of that as feed. You compare that, say, with fishery resources. Of that 185 million tons of fishery resources, we probably only use around about 17, 18 million tons of feed. That's only about 9%. Um, Interestingly, of that fishery resources, the 185 million tons, we use 89%, almost 90% of that as direct food consumption. So it's a real contrasting story compared to fishery use versus grain use within that. But going back to the feed story, if we want to increase production of feed for aquaculture from say 50 million tons of feed to 100 million tons of feed, which is what we're talking about over the next 20 or 30 years, to me, where are we going to find another 50 million tons of protein and oils and starch to support that? Grains. The reality, grains is the only answer. We can't do it with marine resources. I don't think any of the novel ingredients are going to produce anything of, anywhere near more than 100,000 tons in the next 20, 30 years. So the only real answer is grains. And if we ask the question, can we do that? Absolutely. I mean, we're feeding a lot of those grain resources right now, currently, to cattle and pigs who are much less efficient at using those resources than fish and chickens. So the easy equation there for me was to think about, well, let's maybe push some of those resources we're currently feeding to cattle and pigs, push them to chickens, and what we feed the chickens, we push to fish. So it all steps one step to the left in terms of going to the higher value, more efficient producing animal. Okay, we might have less dairy, we might have less beef production, but we have the advantage with dairy and beef production is that we can rear those cows on grass. We can rear them in extensive systems using natural grass production. We don't have to feed them on crop production. Whereas we're feeding a monogastric animal in an intensive agricultural production system like pigs, chickens, and fish, then you really have to provide a feed for that, a manufactured feed for those animals.
Do you think fish meal and fish oil inclusions will stabilize?
Um, no, I think over time they will progressively decrease. If you look at a global scale, let's say, for example, we're currently saying 55 million tons of aquaculture feed production now in, say, 2025, 2026. And we're using about 5 million tons of marine ingredients in that 55 million tons. So it's about 9%. If we roll forward to 2050, and we're producing, say, 100 million tons of aquaculture production, sorry, 100 million tons of aquaculture feed production, so we've effectively doubled it. We're not going to have 10 million tons of marine ingredients available to maintain that supply. Yeah, we might be able to increase production to 6 or 7 million tons based upon increased utilization of things like aquaculture byproducts. So we're seeing some of the fastest growing sectors in terms of fish oil and fish meal supply now are coming from aquaculture side streams. Things like the tilapia or catfish or salmon or even shrimp farming industries, they produce food for us, but they also produce marine ingredients for us too. We don't waste the side streams out of those industries. We valorize them by making them into fish oil and fish meal. And so as those sectors grow, they will also make more marine ingredients, but not at the scale that will allow us to go from maintaining that 9% inclusion across 100 million tons of feed. So we won't get to 9 million tons of production available to support 9 million tons of utilization in aquaculture by 2050. So what we will effectively see is a dilution, probably down to about from 9% down to about, say, 6% or something. But what will happen is those ingredients will increasingly transition towards the higher value markets and the strategic markets, where they play that niche role as a starter feed or a transition or a transfer feed or feeds for particular high value species like things like eels and turtles and so on.
And if we reduce the inclusion rates, it will not have any impact on the growth, performance, feed efficiency, survival, and health, just because we have to use it smartly because it's a value ingredient.
It is, and this is you touch on an important feature there. One of the things that we do know about marine ingredients in particular, fish meal plays an important role as a feed stimulant, intake stimulant. It plays a very strong role in improving palatability of feeds. What I do see in the future is that we will still use fish meal, but we'll also see probably increasing application of what we call hydrolysates. Now, hydrolysates are basically usually protein sources, often marine protein sources, that are hydrolyzed either by enzyme or by acid into small molecular weight peptides and amino acids that are particularly potent feed intake stimulators. And you can include these things in feeds at say 1 or 2% to completely override the feed intake responses by animals. So it's a way of hacking the brain of an animal to trick it into eating something that it otherwise wouldn't want to eat. Now, the reason we don't use them a lot now is because they're expensive. But we're talking about 1 or 2% use. And so I could see maybe over time we're going to see increasingly more of the raw material base from, say, the marine ingredient sector go towards hydrolysate production. And where the hydrolysate production globally now is probably in the thousands of tons, I can see in the next 20, 30 years it's going to go into the tens of thousand tons of production, where it then plays a really key role in allowing us to hack the palatability control of animals. Marine ingredients, fish meal still play a role in there, and there's a trade-off there in balance. Years ago when I was in the feed industry, we were doing a lot of work and screening a lot of the palatants that are available in the market to understand what we could or couldn't do with different types of palatants. And we got to the point where we were testing formulations for shrimp, sea bass, and salmon with zero fish meal. So this is back in 2015. So in 2015, we ran trials on farm with our customers where we had zero fish meal in our feeds for shrimp, sea bass, and salmon. And we got production as good as if you were using fish meal. So same FCR, same growth, not a problem, same quality, everything. But the feeds cost more to do that because the cost of the hydrolysates at that point in time and the inclusion that we needed to use to achieve that outcome meant that those feeds cost more. So what ended up happening is it was actually cheaper to go back and use fish meal.
Yeah.
So yes, you can make a feed with zero fish meal for those species, but it's just not cost effective to do that. And that's the downward pressure you see of the hydrolysates keeping the fish meal price in play, that as well. Where it does get interesting, particularly from the marine ingredient side of the story, though, is that we know there's certain nutrients in some marine ingredients, like, for example, the fish oils. The fish oils have a nutrient called omega-3. Two particular compounds in particular called docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, and icosapentaenoic acid, EPA, that play really important roles in terms of influencing growth in the animal, particularly nerve and brain development and eye development. But they also play really important roles in inflammation regulation in the animals. And so if an animal doesn't have enough of these omega-3 in their diets, when they get confronted with a disease challenge or an injury, the presence of these nutrients allows them to effectively mediate and manage those inflammation responses effectively and improve their survival. When you actually reduce these nutrients below critical thresholds, then you start seeing, a whole range of morbidities and mortality issues increase, and you see welfare issues arising. And that's sort of one of the things that we've seen in some sectors around the world when they've dropped those omega-3 out, is we see some problems. And that to me is one of the critical bottlenecks we see in the feed story, is being able to make sure that we produce enough omega-3 to actually ensure that we maintain adequate health and welfare standards for fish and the animals we produce. Now, some species, and an example here might be, say, things like tilapia. Tilapia are quite effective at producing the omega-3 that they need, the long-chain omega-3 that they need for their own purposes. Other species, say like salmonids and marine fish, not so much. They need it pre-formed as part of their diet. And that's where that bottleneck comes into play, and where fish oils in particular are finding a really important role. And as we're seeing things evolve into the future, we're seeing things like algal oils come into the play there as well. And I see a really strong role into the future for algal oils as basically a strategic uh, ingredient or a strategic feed additive in the feed game. Again, they come in at quite a high price point, but they play a really important role in providing some assurance into maintenance of feed quality and nutrient supply going forward.
Right. So clearly, the feed mills will be using fish meal and fish oil as a strategic ingredient that will be used to unlock the performance of the entire feed formula, right? Because there are a lot of discussions going on that how do we replace fish meal and fish oil with other ingredients? So we will come to that dialogue later on. But clearly, if we were to eliminate fish meal and fish oil from the feed formulations, that then it means to say that we are really disconnecting the nutritional value of ingredients and the nutritional requirements of the animal, right? So we will come back to that replacement dialogue later on. Before that, I just want to touch upon the the discussions happening around the global greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, food systems are responsible for roughly one third of global greenhouse gas emissions. Uh, Yet, aquaculture contributes only around 0.49% of global emissions, right? So, but within aquaculture, since feed is the dominant contributor, which accounts nearly 65% of emissions, and this data is according to the Cargill Sea Further report. So with retailers and seafood buyers increasingly pushing producers to reduce scope 3 emissions, how is the marine ingredient sector responding to this pressure?
Yeah, so one of the important things you pick up there on is, we look at the footprint, and here we're talking mostly about carbon footprint with aquaculture. Um, about 2/3 of it comes from the feed. Um, what we also need to understand is of the 2/3 of the feed, about 90% of that's from agriculture. And that's even in feeds, say like salmon or shrimp, that use quite high inclusion levels of marine ingredients. The agricultural contribution to the footprint is huge. It's most of it. And the reality there is that most agricultural ingredients have a much higher footprint than marine ingredients. You look at for example, you think about basically when you make a marine ingredient, you catch the fish, you bring it to shore, and you process it into marine ingredients. So you're using energy to catch the fish, and then you're using energy to process and dry and cook the fish to make the marine ingredient. When you're growing something like, say, wheat or soybean or rapeseed, you're you're driving a tractor over a field multiple times, right? And often over the same ground again and again. You go once to plow the field, once more to seed the field, once more to spray a herbicide, once more to spray an insecticide, and a fifth time to harvest the crop. And then you're pulling out per hectare, in many cases, only probably several tons per hectare. So you look at the amount of energy expended to actually produce a yield of several tons of food, it's huge. It's huge. Not only that, but you look at it from a biodiversity perspective. I mean, fisheries operate within natural ecosystems. You go out to the natural ecosystem of the ocean, you run a net around a shoal of fish, you pull them in, take them ashore. You contrast that with, say, agriculture, where you go to what was a natural grassland or forest ecosystem, you wipe it clean, you then plow the field, and then plant a monoculture of one species of plant, which you then wipe out all the competing plant biodiversity by using herbicides, and you wipe out all the animal biodiversity by using insecticides. So it has a really bad biodiversity footprint, as well as a really bad carbon footprint associated with just the energy use of that production system. Now, despite those issues we have with agriculture, we don't have a better option. Agriculture, it is the food production system we have. Okay. So it's not a case of, oh, we should stop doing agriculture. No, we have to do this. We've just got to learn to do it better, I think. And there is efforts being made to improve and make agriculture more effective and efficient through things like genetic selection programs to get higher yields, or reducing tillage or ploughing of land to actually reduce the amount of energy having to be expended to grow agricultural crops and so on. So, but irrespective of the way we look at it, the usage of grain products, which is really, as we say, it's already about 75% of total feed production, for aquaculture, even more if we look for terrestrial animal production. That's not going to change. That's going to go up, if anything, I think. It's always going to be the main contributor to the footprint there. What we are also seeing, particularly with the marine ingredients story, is that as we increasingly valorize the side streams from fish processing, so we're catching fish, say herring or mackerel, for human consumption, or tuna is another good example, and then the side streams that we're not eating, we're processing those into marine ingredients. The footprints associated with those side streams is much lower than, say, if we just use the whole fish for making marine ingredients on a per ton basis. And so that's actually allowing us to reduce the pressure of that feed footprint quite substantially by particularly focusing on the use of those side streams and those byproduct marine ingredients, marine oils, and marine meals. And I see that sort of continuing into the future. We're going to increasingly valorize those side streams from aquaculture, fisheries. I think increasingly some of the forage fisheries that we currently harvesting, and they're going to feed production, meal and oil production, we're going to start valorizing them as food sources, and they will become increasingly used for food. But that process of using those resources for food will still make streams for feed. The side streams will be used for feed. An example there might be the oil sardine in India as a good example. And particularly down on southern India in Kerala, a lot of that oil sardine is eaten as a food source. I can see in next 20 or 30 years, the Indian people going, well, that oil sardine, actually, we should eat more of it. And they might set up a canning industry or a processing industry or a smoking industry to valorize that food source. But that will still make fish meal and fish oil as a side stream from that. So, like fish meal will never go away. It will always be there because it's a side stream, and it's often the next best option to use the side streams from the food production system.
Absolutely. Like you touched base on sardines from India, Kerala. I was doing some of my research. I found out that sardines is so abundant, even after fulfilling human consumption. If they are not harvested, they will have a high mortality.
Yeah,
Because majority of these small pelagics, they never reach maturity, and then they migrate if not harvested when in the water. So, and of course, it is climate driven, and it is filter feeding, because if they don't get phytoplankton or zooplankton, they will survive. They will starve, right? So there are discussions happening that harvesting forage fish represents a lost carbon sequestration opportunity. They say that the effective footprint could be higher. What do you have to say about that?
It's one of the fundamental truths about small pelagic fisheries, whether it's the oil sardine in India or the anchoveta in Peru or the menhaden in Americas or the sprat in Europe, is that these small pelagic species tend to be short-lived species.
Yeah.
They mature after 1 or 2 years, and they only live for 3 or 4 years, and then they die. Such that if you have a boom period where the population explodes because of climatic conditions, and because of the nature of these animals, that when resources are abundant, their population explodes, and then when the resources deplete, their population crashes. And we see that quite commonly with animals that are low down in the trophic system, that when you have times of plenty or abundance, their populations explode. When the abundance disappears, the populations crash as well. So from a fishery perspective, what you're better off doing is if the animal gets to a certain size and it's had a chance to contribute to recruitment in that fishery, then you may as well harvest it, because if you don't harvest it, it's a lost opportunity, lost economic opportunity, lost social opportunity, lost resource opportunity for that country, that region. Ideally, when you catch that resource, the best use of it is for us to eat it directly. And the best way to do that is to eat it fresh. And I love getting fresh sardines, for example, and barbecuing them on my barbecue at home and eating them fresh. Nothing better. But after two or three sardines, I generally, I want something different. And I think most people are like that. They enjoy one or two sardines, but they don't want to eat 10 of them. So the next best option, if you don't want to eat fresh sardines, is to freeze them, so you can eat them at another time in the future. But even if you freeze them, you've only got about a 3-month period with sardines and other high oil species, is because the EPA DHA content in their fats makes even under -20 conditions, they begin to decay and oxidize. So you can't keep them forever. You got to use them within 3 months. So freezing buys you time, but comes at a very high energy cost to do that. Option 3, right? We process those fish and we can them. We can smoke them or can them. We can try and preserve them, and that buys us more time, maybe up to a year. But that
Yeah.
process will also produce side streams, of which we then have to valorize somewhere. And that brings us to option 4. The best option 4 is to dehydrate the fish. So we remove the water, and that stabilizes that. And that's sort of what most places do, whether it's India or Peru or say Norway. Those high abundance fish that they cannot eat fresh, freeze, or can, they dehydrate. And dehydrated fish is called fish meal and fish oil. And that's the way we can stabilize that resource. And that gives us 1.5 years of usage time after we stabilize it. So we can then use that ingredient for the next 18 months. So it's a way of taking those resources, which are often very available in a very finite place and time, and actually allows us to extend their utilization over time, and means we can then capture those nutrients and then actually spread those through our food chain, whether it's in the form of omega-3 or in the form of essential amino acids, by feeding those nutrients either directly to ourselves. We can put things like omega-3 in our diet through capsules, or taking a teaspoon of cod liver oil or something, or anchoveta oil, or we can put them into feeds for animals that we want to then manage and harvest when we want to have them available for our food supply. And that's sort of what we do in most respects, I think. But it's important to note that when you do that process of managing small pelagic fisheries, is that you need to understand the dynamics associated with the abundance of those animals. Looking at the spatial arrangements where are they in space and in time, and how that changes over time in terms of the size of the animals and their reproductive status. So you need to understand where they are spawning, at what age they're spawning, and what time of year they're spawning, and at what, when you understand what age they begin to spawning and producing eggs and offspring into that biomass, then you can actually start working on it's called a TAC, a total allowable catch, which is a quota estimate. So this relies on some highly complex mathematics from fishery scientists to understand, right, based upon the animal recruitment, size of the population, where it is, this is how we should best manage that resource. And then you can put in controls, because you don't control the fish, you just control the fishing. So we can then put in controls by saying how many people we can let fish, and what gear they can use, where they can take the fish, and when they can take the fish, and how much fish they can take. And when you do that, and you actually look at the mathematics for that, you can actually effectively do that year after year after year after year. And to me, that's almost the definition of sustainability. If you can set in a process of providing a robust mathematical assessment of how much fish you can harvest to allow you to take from a resource without impacting the long-term sustainability or security of that resource to continue providing that resource, that's almost the definition of sustainability in my view. If I could harvest 1 million tons of fish and then come back next year and the fish are back again at the same resource, the same abundance that we were last year, that's perfect. But there's lots of effort that has to go into allowing you to do that. A lot of it's monitoring, as well as also the fishery assessments and also the calculation of the TAC each year.
Right. Some of the earlier metrics like fish in, fish oil, focus mainly on how much fish goes into feed, right? But now the industry is slowly moving towards life cycle assessment as the more holistic way of measuring sustainability. So since we're talking about sustainability here, could you could you explain a little bit about how LCA changes the way we evaluate uh, marine ingredients?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I mean, if you think about the whole fish in, fish out story, which basically looked at it was a ratio of how much fish you included in a feed relative to the yields of meal and oil that you got out of 1 ton of fish multiplied by the FCR to effectively arrive at a calculation that allows you to look at, well, how many tons of fish did you use to harvest a certain amount of tons of fish? Now, obviously, the easiest way to reduce that number is actually just reduce your inclusion of fish in the feed, or you can improve your FCR. Now, improving FCR is much harder than changing your inclusion of the fish. But the reality is that feed formulations are a zero-sum game. If I remove fish meal and fish oil from the feed, I can't just leave a hole there. I have to put something back. Okay. So if I remove fish oil from the equation, I have to bring in something like a vegetable oil. If I remove fish meal from the feed, I then have to bring in something like a soybean meal that goes into the feed. The feed formulation has to add up to 100% every time. And what the fish in, fish out doesn't do is it doesn't assess the trade-offs associated with that calculation. So I'm under pressure with the fish in, fish out ratio. And there's been derivatives of that since. The forage fish dependency ratio, the FFDR, the EFIFO, the economic fish in, fish out, and there's even a new one called the nutrient fish in, fish out ratio as well. But all they do is put pressure on the fish equation to push fish out without actually assessing the consequences of what you bring in. And so what we've noticed, and there's a really, really cool paper that got published about a month ago by some of my former colleagues from the University of Stirling, where they looked at the net effects of what's happened in Europe in the last 20 years with that whole story. So Europe had a very active program over the last 20 years of trying to reduce marine ingredients in feeds. And between 2020 to between 20 year 2000 and 2020, they reduced total marine ingredient utilization in the industry by about 13%. The industry grew massively over that period of time, but total marine ingredient actually went down. So, for example, in Europe, we use less fish meal and fish oil now than we did 20 years ago in actual tonnage. But when they looked at other things like carbon footprints or water usage or land usage or ecotoxicity or energy usage, they all went up massively. So when you look at the whole story of sustainability and environmental impact assessment, sustainability is more than fish in, fish out. Environmental impact is more than fish in, fish out. If you actually look at the life cycle assessment sciences, there isn't actually a parameter in LCA called fish in, fish out. There is one called biotic resource use, and that applies to any biological resource use. But of the main 16 parameters that life cycle assessment assesses, there isn't really one that assesses biological resource use or even biodiversity. It focuses on things like carbon footprint, water use, land use, ecotoxicity, fossil fuel resource use, all these sorts of things. And typically, the advantage of using that system is that system can be applied to anything we use in the feed story. So we can use LCA equally for soybean, for wheat, for marine ingredients, for single cell ingredients, for insect meals. They can all be effectively assessed using that same framework, which then means when I go to make a formulation, so a bit like the same way I formulate a feed to work out what is the amino acid or omega-3 composition of a feed, I can also formulate to a carbon footprint target or an ecotoxicity target using LCA information, because that framework collects information on all those ingredients using the same approach. And that allows me to effectively assess trade-offs then. So I can then understand, if I reduce fish meal in the formulation, what the consequences of that change are on, say, carbon footprint or ecotoxicity, or any of those other LCA parameters. That's why the LCA story is so important, is because it means I'm not transferring the risk from one ingredient onto another, or making a change to improve my FIFO, but actually end up deteriorating the carbon footprint or the sustainability outcomes of the feed. And this was actually the outcome of that study I talked about that was published a month ago, is that what we can see is over the last 20 years, feeds across Europe had become less sustainable because they had focused so heavily on pushing marine ingredients out, that they'd taken the eye off the real story, which was actually about understanding things like energy use, resource use, land use change, water use change, which are actually the fundamental impact assessment categories that we focus on for true sustainability assessment. And they had all got worse because we'd been too focused on the fish in, fish out story.
So do we mean to say that currently, though life cycle assessments is at a very infancy stage, they are becoming the most transparent way to evaluate sustainability. But my question is that, do you think that the current LCAs fully capture the food security trade-offs? Of course, especially in countries like where forage fish are a staple of food for local communities.
No, not completely. I mean, as I mentioned, so LCA is we use the expression in English, say, a broad church. It covers a whole range of different things sometimes. And there's different methods that can be applied to the way in which we assess LCA as well. Now, because of that, different organizations like the FAO have set up rules, what they call the LEAP guidelines, the LEAP guidelines, that they use to provide overarching guidance of how we should look at LCA as a tool in this space. The International Standardization Organization, ISO, has also set up rules. They're the ISO 14040 series rules. But there's also rules within the European Union that we have. It was called the European Union PEFCR, the Product Environment Footprint Categorization Rules. They set up rules for how we're supposed to do things like LCA for feed and feed ingredients. So they set up the rules by which we have to use, including the methodologies we have to approach, including what parameters we have to include in the assessments, things like energy use, transport, auxiliary materials, storage, and so on, infrastructure as well. So they set up that to try and provide an overarching framework to allow comparability across ingredients. But the one that you bring in there as an example is, well, what about food security? LCA doesn't currently, the standard rules for, say, the methods that are primarily advocated in LCA at the moment don't implicitly pick up food sustainability. There is some methods that can be applied to LCA, but they're not in the standard methods that are being recommended. But I know there is people out there looking at ways of potentially adapting these methods. Look at things like biotic resource use, or more correctly, what we should look at is what we call biotic resource depletion. And to give you a contrast, what I mean by there. So we could look at, say, biotic resource use, and you might look at, say, this, for example, the Peruvian anchoveta fishery. Now, that fishery harvests about 4 million tons of fish a year. It's the world's biggest single species fishery. So they use, the biotic resource use there is 4 million tons of fish a year. But if I look at biotic resource depletion, what that looks at is not the total resource used, it looks at what's depleted from year to year. Because if we actually look at sustainability and what we really want to achieve here, and really what we're looking to try and ensure is that we're not using resources for the present at the expense of the future, is we need to look at, well, what is the change that resource use over time? So biotic resource depletion looks at, okay, if I use 4 million tons now, so there's a 10 million ton population of fish there, for example, with anchoveta. If I harvest 4 million tons from that, when I come back to the fishery next year, what's the volume of fish again that's available? Is it 6 million tons or is it 10 million tons? And the reality is, well, it's 10 million tons again because the fish are growing and we've got the next season's recruitment coming back. So the net bite resource depletion there would be zero because you haven't depleted the stock. The stock is well managed and you're operating within the TAC of that effect of that stock on a sustainable basis. If I harvest 4 million tons and then came back and next year only 6 million tons was available, then what I would have is bite resource depletion of 4 million tons. And that's a very different thing. Now you're seeing actual depletion of the stock, and you know, okay, if it's not coming back, it's not recovering, right? That's not a good thing. So then that's when you need to start putting in arrangements to actually change the way in which you would manage things. So they're the sort of things where people are investigating now with the LCA story to bring in other metrics like bioresource depletion or biodiversity impacts is another one to actually understand how our activities, whether it's farming or fishing or aquaculture, how they impact long-term resource sustainability across our food and supply chains. And that's, to me, that's where that story needs to go in the longer term.
Do we have interesting findings from the recent LCAs, which suggest that currently marine ingredients use increasingly byproducts from seafood processing?
Look, one of the resources available out there is another initiative called the Global Feed Life Cycle Assessment Institute, the GFLI. Website's www.gfli.org, and they maintain a database that has about 2,000 plus ingredients on it, including quite a few marine ingredients, as well as all the other typical feed ingredients we use around the world, all collected using that PEFCR or that FAO LEAP guidelines and ISO 14040 series guidelines for collecting that LCA information. So it's all collected through a consistent process that has to be audited internally, audited externally before it can update the database. When we look at that database across all the 16 standard categories, what we typically see with most feed ingredients is that they might be high in one impact category, but then they're lower in another one. There might be, for example, I think like pea protein concentrates, for example, are high in water use, but they're low in ecotoxicity. Something like soybean concentrate, high in carbon footprint, but low in ecotoxicity, sort of thing. There's actually very few feed ingredients available that tend to be low across large numbers of those 16 indicators. But ironically, marine ingredients are one of them. They tend to be really low across most indicators we see on the LCA framework, which is one of the reasons why, as an industry, we've really embraced this metric, is because we finally see an assessment framework that allows us to be compared, on the same framework as all the other feed ingredients, and we look really good when we do that. So that's why we're jumping on board, and we're in the process of undertaking a project with the GFLI to update their database using data obtained directly from the industry. A lot of the data that's in the GFLI at the moment is what we call secondary data. It's data that's derived from secondary sources like scientific papers or company reports, or estimates by LCA practitioners. It's not actually data that's come from the companies producing those ingredients themselves. So we're trying to change that and actually update the database with data that's actually from marine ingredient producers from around the world. And so far what we're seeing is that the marine ingredient footprints, they vary substantially. Typically on average, they're around about 1,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for a meal and about 1,500 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for an oil across globally on a weighted average. But you can get some products that are down as low as 150 or 200 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, and others that are into the thousands. But one particular class that we see is really, really, really low is the byproduct streams. Those side streams or byproduct streams that we get from processing fish for human consumption. Because of the way the calculation works, it has an economic weighting in the calculation, such that when you harvest, say, a sardine, is a good example for human consumption. About 50% of the sardine is canned or eaten by the humans. 50% of the mass goes for production of meal and oil. But when you look at the value of the side stream, the biomass that goes to meal and oil production, and the value of the food product that goes into canning or smoke, say, sardines, it's about 95% food value, 5% side stream value. So when you look at the footprint that comes from the fishing part of that activity, 95% goes to the food chain, 5% goes to the side stream chain. And because so little of the footprint comes into the side stream, that's what goes into as the base footprint for calculating the footprint for meal and oil as well. So we end up with a very low meal and oil footprint coming from those side streams, from things say like mackerel or tuna or sardines or herring that are all caught mostly for human consumption. Their side stream meals are very, very low in their impact, their impact calculations.
Right. And many noble ingredients, such as insect meal, single cell proteins, and algae, are also presenting themselves as low carbon and circular solutions, right? So if they also claim that that novel ingredients have lower environmental footprints and circular production systems, just like marine ingredients, how should the industry compare marine ingredients with these emerging alternatives?
It's interesting that you say that, because most of the calculations that have looked at things like single cell proteins and algal oils and meals and even insect proteins, their footprints are not very low at all. People have often made the claims of sustainability in the novel ingredients based upon the novelty of the ingredients, not actually a objectively measured sustainability footprint. We are seeing there's a couple of companies now in the insect space. I'm not going to mention any names, but a couple of companies that have actually redone their assessments recently. There was assessments done about 5 or 6 years ago that showed that the typical footprint for insect meal was about 5,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of insect meal. And the new ones, they're about the same as fish meal, about that 1,000 mark. But that's only from one or two particular companies. What we're seeing is that there's quite a high footprint with things like insect meals because they use a lot of energy in maintaining energy or temperature regulation of the production facilities. And also in many cases, the inputs that they're using into the feeding the insects are not waste streams, they're actually feed streams. So in Europe, for example, we can't legally use food waste streams or manure to grow insects. We can only use feed streams. So in some respects, the insect production in Europe, at least, is actually competing with the feed sector, not actually contributing to the feed sector. And that's a problem that we need to fix. We need to look at how we can change that sector to becoming a net contributor to feed security rather than actually depleting from it in some aspect. Because the reality is, moving forward, is we need all these feed ingredients available, but they're all going to contribute more. We have to contribute more to production, not actually reduce the production we have. And a lot of these sectors are actually using things like brewery waste streams. Now, brewery waste streams are already a useful feed ingredient for pigs and poultry. So if we're feeding lots of those to insects, then that's not available for pigs and poultry. From my view, it doesn't make sense to feed your feed ingredients. That's something that you shouldn't really do unless you have a resource stream that has no value or can't go into a feed sector direct. Things like waste fruit and vegetables, that might be one option. But there's issues in that with also things like sanitation regulations. You can't use food wastage from restaurants. You can't use animal feces wastage. That's largely because of biosecurity reasons. We can't do that. And I can't see that changing any time into the future. But the other sectors, like, say, algal oil and single cell protein, their energy usage is quite high, and so their footprints are quite considerably much larger than we see for the marine ingredients. And most of those sectors are making very strong efforts to reduce. I know one company that's reduced its carbon footprint by more than 25% in the last couple of years, but it's still 4 or 5 times that of marine ingredients, even though they've made that reduction. For me, the novel ingredient story is not about having an ingredient that is more sustainable. It's about producing essential nutrients that we have to have to actually meet feed security into the future. And the example I use there is, say, things like algal oils. I don't care if algal oil has a higher carbon footprint than fish oil. To me, that's not the story, not the issue. The issue is I need more omega-3, because otherwise I'm going to be putting the welfare of the animals I grow at compromise, or I'm going to be depleting the omega-3 in the fish I'm wanting to produce. Therefore, I'm decreasing the quality of those animals for human consumption if I deplete that omega-3 out of those. So I need that algal oil to continue to provide the omega-3 as a security strategy, like an insurance policy going into the future. I think increasingly we need to not look at the algal oil story as a sustainability story or a carbon footprint story. That's not the reason why we have algal oil. It's about security of supply of omega-3 and making sure that when we have events like the recent El Nino event in 2023-24 that we had, and we lost about 15%, 20% of global omega-3 supply because of the El Nino event, that we don't have those issues of supply anymore, that we can ride those storms out to make sure we have better ability to supply that resource into the future.
Absolutely. See, why we are having all these conversations, because if we look at a global picture, especially in the shrimp industry is becoming increasingly competitive, right? Um, the factors like volatile prices and supply is capped, and then there are increasing pressures on reducing emissions. And at the same time, we need to scale the supply, right? And all these factors are pushing the industry in a way to explore innovative ingredients that promise scalability, traceability, maybe circularity, and potentially help the industry lower environmental footprints. So I think in a way, innovation is something that at this point in time, industry cannot afford to ignore. But of course, every new ingredient will come with its own challenges. But I feel that the potential benefits are so strong that companies are willing to invest in research and development. For example, recently, skywriting trials showed that black soldier fly cut the cost by 9 to 13%. So that is also, and there are other pilot programs going on, right? So, of course, perhaps the bigger point, like you said, that is that sustainability does not mean any ingredient will have zero impact, right? The real question is that how, as an industry, we reduce these impacts collectively, right? And also, of course, we are having a very mature discussion that it's not about choosing the sites, but how can we build a feed system that is nutritionally balanced and economically viable, and also climate friendly, and of course support the growing food security of the global world, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to sometimes reflect that the feed story and our food story, it's not just a sustainability story. Sustainability is an important part of the discussion, but it is also about nutrient supply, the quality of the nutrients that are being supplied, the cost of the nutrients that are supplied, and the availability, which of course is linked to the cost story there, and the sustainability is part of that as well, and safety, food safety. So making sure that we're not bringing in any unintended impacts or consequences associated with things that we bring into our food chain, whether they're disease risks, or their contaminant risks, or that we have ways of mitigating and managing those risks. I see the feed story as a case of understanding what the trade-offs we have. I mean, there is no food production capable of anything that is impact free. It's just it doesn't happen. So what we need to understand is that everything is a trade-off. Sometimes we might be looking to say, all right, well, we're going to make this food product and we'll get more availability, but it will come at slightly higher impact or sustainability impact. Or we might basically have this food production and it's a higher quality niche value and it might have associated with it a higher impact, but that's a trade-off that people are prepared to pay. Or you might say, we're going to make a large volume of food production and we're going to try and minimize the impact, but it might cost a bit more to do that. So there's lots of different trade-offs here that come into this equation, depending upon how we balance priorities through time and space and geography, really. And another important part of that story is, of course, the purchasing power of different markets. The proportion of our income that we spend on food is not the same everywhere. So some people are prepared to spend a higher proportion of their income on higher quality, higher niche value products. And if that's their choice, they might choose to eat a better quality seafood and have one less holiday somewhere, for example. Other people might say, well, okay, I just need to focus on eating what food I can get to feed my kids and, and might spend less on, clothing or something. Every decision we make as part of humanity is a trade-off, really. And I don't see that ever changing.
Absolutely. So, Brett, you just mentioned that it's also about how big your pocket is, right? And how
Yeah.
conscious the today's consumer is with respect to um, paying when it comes to eating a healthier food, right? So, around that dialogue, I want to understand: are we trying to say that that marine ingredients will be increasingly used for uh, for producing those kind of products which add to the value, or it will also be equally used for the products which is going to the mass consumers?
I think it's a bit of both. Obviously things like we talked a bit before about the algal oil story, and I see algal oil as a an essential feature of any modern commercial feed business these days as a tool they have in their factory. But not to the exclusion of fish oil. I mean, fish oil is still the main supplier of omega-3 into the feed industry, and it will be for forever in the future, I think. But it's I think it's going to play a bit of a balancing game with the algal oil story. So the algal oil will basically provide that niche value to allow you to modulate or regulate the amount of EPA and DHA in a feed, while marine ingredients will provide the bulk of that nutrient. I mean, you look at the costs per unit EPA DHA, for example, it'd be more expensive with algae, as it should be, but it's in there to provide that like an insurance policy in that story. In that same sort of frame, what we will also find is that there will still always be, going into the future, fish meal supply. And places like China, for example, which uses about 2.5 million tons of fish meal a year, they're not using it, just in the high value species. It's going across a broad range of species, because it provides a range of strategic functionality into the feed formulation process. Now, as we better learn to manage the side streams from aquaculture into the future and fisheries, now we should be able to increase that marine ingredient supply to actually maintain that strategic use of that ingredient into the future, as a feed ingredient that provides that functionality. But we're just going to have to get better at it, I think, because the total volume we will be seeking, it will progressively get less and less compared to what we're trying to make into the future. So it'll always be there. I think marine ingredients, meals and oils and hydrolysates. It's important to think about the marine ingredient story. It's not just meals and oils. Hydrolysates and algal oils are also a key part of that story. And to give you an example, that all the major algal oil producers in the world are members of IFO. They're members of the IFO family. And we have many members who produce hydrolysates as part of the IFO family as well. So they are very much clearly in the marine ingredient space. And, it covers the whole range of things. There's niche targeted value, the high value, and there's also lower cost materials that actually play a role in supporting basically large scale, low cost production. It's a very diversified portfolio, we would say.
Right, right. It's very interesting. At the same time, it's very complicated, very complex.
It is very complex. And one of the things I've been working on the last 3 or 4 years is doing all the life cycle impact assessment work for the industry. And it's amazing to see how complex it is in terms of following the supply chains from fisheries or aquaculture all the way through to, hydrolysate production and feed application and the different strategies and the number of people or actors involved in different parts of the supply chain and how it goes through processing or it goes direct and then how it gets revalued or refined and which parts go to human consumption directly, which parts go to animal consumption, which animal consumption market they go to. It's a really interesting story.
Right. And if I come back to the price element, okay, now aqua feed has hit 60 million tons in 2024. Um, and today the market is valued at $130 billion, right? And we know that feed drives 50 to 70% of farmer costs. And we know that fish meal and fish oil is stuck or has increased, but not proportionately over the years, right? And at the same time, we have felt the impact of climate change, like El Nino, which has affected the supply coming increasingly from Peru that supplies 20 to 25% to the rest of the world, right? And this phenomena has caused 20 to 30% price swings, including India as a major importer. And you know that India's or take margins across the world. I'm talking in with respect to India. India's Vanami margins are razor thin, right, because of the competition that we all know. Then, in this context, how do our farmers survive? Because they cannot pass the feed price shocks downstream, and then this turns sustainability into a survival issue. Not just an environmental subject or a nutritional subject or a carbon footprint subject. It becomes a survival issue. So, what is your take on that, Red?
There's two ways to look at that. I mean, it's worth reflecting on the fish meal and fish oil story in terms of the price and the price volatility. I mean, arguably, we look at, say, the long-term base price for fish meal is around $2,000 US a ton. It goes up and below that mark. And I think currently it's around about 1,800, and it varies according to grade, of course. Fish oil base price is probably about $3,000 a ton, right? But when we have acute shortages like we had in 2023, that price for feed grade oil goes from 3,000 to about 6,000, $7,000 a ton. It doubled. So it's more than 25% variability. It was 100% variability. And that's not as bad as what happened for the human food grade. The human food grade oil went from $3,000 to $12,000 a ton. Fourfold increase, massive increase. But that's not the feed grade oil that we're talking about here. I was actually at a conference 2 weeks ago in Norway, the North Atlantic Seafood Forum, and there was a presentation by, I think it was one of the guys from Rabobank, and he actually put up a figure showing all the volatility of all the major feed ingredients used. And this was looking at feed ingredient volatility from like 2015 to like 2010 or something, I think, or no, 2015, 10-year volatility. Now, interestingly, fish meal had amongst the lowest price volatility of all the major commodities used. Much lower than soybean, much lower than wheat, much lower than rapeseed oil, much lower than crude oil, for example. Fish oil, not so much. It had a much more volatile story there. But that came in because when we had the El Nino that you mentioned before, there's a lot of price pressure in the fish oil market that's been driven by human consumption, the human nutraceutical market. Now, for example, 80% of the production in Peru now, oil production, goes to human consumption, not feed consumption. So when we get a shortage, like we get in an El Nino, and El Nino years in particular are particularly acutely felt in Peru because of the way it influences the Humboldt Current there off the west coast of South America and the behavior of the anchoveta in that fishery. So they feel it particularly acutely. And it's a major problem for that country because it causes major impacts in terms of national revenue, national employment, social upheaval. It's a major issue for them. But they're just going to have to deal with it because it's a natural phenomenon. It's always been happening. There's arguments about whether it's increasing more regularly or not, but it's something that's always been there. How do we deal with that, which was your primary question? Well, the example that you gave was the Vaname industry. The Vaname industry has been operating on razor thin margins, as you mentioned recently. And for me, the way that you need to deal with that is by increasing the demand for your product and less worrying about the cost of the inputs coming in. The inputs coming in are responding solely to supply and demand dynamics. They cannot control that. That will be driven by things like if you get a drought in America or Brazil and it wipes out half the soybean crop, soy prices is going to skyrocket too. If we get increasing pressure to use wheat and corn in bioethanol, then that's going to drive up competition for wheat and corn as well, which will also mean their supplies into the feed market will also be impacted as well. So there's still climate pressure and competition pressure in the agricultural side of things as much as there is also in the marine ingredient side of things. What the Vaname sector can do, because they can't influence that pressure or the price volatility of their feed commodities, is they can work on a market development strategy for their industry. They can work on how do we increase demand for shrimp consumption. And one of the things I found really quite surprising was that India, which is now one of the world's largest producers of Vaname, India's grown massively there, but Indians don't eat a lot of shrimp themselves. I mean, you're sitting on the biggest country in the world by population, 1.4 billion people, who seem to have yet come on to the idea that shrimp's a really good thing to eat. It's actually really quite sustainable, tastes really good, and you grow it locally. I find it surprising that you actually export most of this stuff. You should be eating this locally. There should be like shrimp gumbo bars everywhere up and down the east and west coast of India, promoting an Indian style, Goan prawn curry sort of thing. I think it'd be fantastic. I'd love to go to, have a Goan curry that's based on prawns instead of fish, for example. And I think with a bit of market development and a bit of marketing, I think the Indian people would love that. I think they'd come right at it. And to me, that would be an easy win for the Indian industry alone to do that. And that's internalizing that economy. And obviously, you can then balance that internal economy with some export supply as well. So, it's one of the things you look at, say, the aquaculture industry in China, why it grows and develops so well is because they're focusing on feeding their own people first and then exporting surplus. To me, that's something I think we could do in India too, increasingly grow aquaculture, fish and shrimp, Vaname, and adopt that as part of the national cuisine.
Yes. So, see, let me first address that why India has not been able to tap the domestic, competitiveness as of now. because we have been razor focused on how to serve the growing world, you know. And now
Mm.
we have realized, amidst all the pressures that the world is facing, and increasingly tough regulations that we keep addressing every now and then, we have realized that it is how important it is to increase the domestic consumption, because it will help India stay resilient amidst all those pressures, right?
To me, the answer is really obvious. And I look at the example, 20, 30 years ago, Chile was a major exporter of fish meal and fish oil, right? They have large fisheries for anchoveta, sardine, and jurel, jack mackerel. And they were catching this fish, they're making meal and oil, and then they were exporting it. And then, as their own aquaculture industry developed in Chile, what they worked out is actually it's far smarter not to export this stuff, but to actually use it internally. And then you can import other things and then actually value add that with your own products to retain those nutrients within your own system. And I see the same story with India. India, most of the marine ingredients they produce at the moment, the oil and meal from the oil sardine off the west coast of India, it's exported. Most of it goes to China. And I actually think what you're better off doing, you take that equation, say we talk about at the moment, say 50% or 50 million tons of aqua feed, 5 million tons of marine ingredient use, 10%, a bit less than that, but so let's say 10% for argument's sake. If India took that same approach and took all the marine ingredient they produced and then value added that marine ingredient by adding soybean to it, which India grows locally, adding wheat to it, which India grows locally, adding corn to it, which India grows locally, adding minerals and vitamins, make that into a feed to then actually grow the animals that India consumes domestically. And that food production, if you're growing things like fish and shrimp, it's far more efficient to grow fish and shrimp than it is to grow, say, things like pigs or cows or even chickens. Then you end up with more food. And particularly if you retain the fish meal and fish oil within that system, that means the omega-3, the really valuable nutrients that are really important for our diet too, stay within that domestic food chain. So at the moment, you're exporting your omega-3 to places like China and everywhere else, rather than keeping that omega-3 within the Indian population. And so this is where I think there's an opportunity here for you to take that marine ingredient, put it into shrimp feed, expand its application through the use of other ingredients that you produce domestically to grow, 1 million tons of shrimp in India. And then the shrimp, from 1 million tons of shrimp, you can end up with 500,000 tons of shrimp protein, which can then feed the Indian people. And that shrimp protein can be omega-3 enriched. There's some good science out now showing that we can enrich shrimp muscle with omega-3. And so that's an effective tool to deliver heightened omega-3 to the population. And we also know that humans need to eat about 50 grams of protein a day. And shrimp protein is actually a really healthy protein to eat. So to me, I just see there's win-win-win here if India takes this resource and looks to value add it and then push it into its domestic production sector without having to externalize that as a means of capturing that resource internally to then value add it. If you looked at that as a value chain from the fishery product harvesting through to the value and quality of the food consumption going into the Indian population at the other end, that's a great value adding story, I think, there that we could capture better.
Absolutely. See, increasing domestic consumption is our priority now. And like you said, that we should focus on value added, that's on the go. It will pick up in the years to come, because our government is focusing on branding, on running marketing campaigns. But again, my question is that how will that increase in demand will help us balance the price? Because currently we are importing fish meal and fish oil from countries like China, Peru, uh, to meet our current requirement. I was just researching a little bit on Peruvian coastline and Indian coastline. I was shocked to look at the at the records. Peru has a 2500 kilometer coastline, right? India have extensive 11,000 kilometer coastline and diverse small pelagic fisheries, but still we are limited to only 10% of the world fish meal and fish oil production, right? And ironically, I read that 70% of our coastlines remain unexplored.
It's
Did you
the
know
important thing
that?
to remember is it's, and I use the example there. I mean, I was born and grew up in Australia.
Hmm.
Now, we talk about Peru there having a coastline of 2,500 kilometers. Australia's coastline is like 100,000 kilometers. It's one of the biggest coastlines of any country in the world. Yet the volume of fishery production in Peru is around about 4 million tons a year, and the volume of production in Australia, fishery production, is less than 100,000 tons a year. It's not the coastline that matters. It's not the size of the coastline that matters. It's the where that coastline is. And there's certain places in the world where we get what we call our upwelling areas, areas which have particular um, oceanographic features that we see assemblages of fish populations in high abundance. Peru is one of these regions. Chile is another one. It's the whole west coast of South America is a particular upwelling area because of the way the Humboldt current works there. The southwest coast of Africa, for example, South Africa and Namibia is another one. The northwest coast of Africa, and then Morocco and Mauritania is another one. The west coast of India is another one. India and Oman and Pakistan is another upwelling area here. But I'm not so sure about the east coast of India, the area near Chennai. I don't know if that's an upwelling area. I would suggest perhaps not. Otherwise, we would have heard about it by now. But then the other places like the west coast of Australia is not an upwelling area. It doesn't get these big populations of fish. In fact, these big upwellings that we see in many other continents, Australia actually doesn't have many of those at all, which is why it doesn't have very many very large fisheries. So it's really important to understand the nature of the oceanography of the regions that we're looking at and the fishery resources that are available in those regions, and having a robust scientific assessment of what those resources are and how they change over time and space. Because it's only once you understand what the nature of those resources are, what species, where they are, how it changes through time and space, then you can then effectively set up effective, sustainable fisheries to actually manage those resources. And once you do that, and if you do it properly, I mean, if we do fisheries management properly, we should have food forever. That's the beautiful thing about fisheries. If we do it properly, we can not only maintain what we've got forever, but we can actually probably even rebuild fisheries to increase their productivity. And there's good examples we're seeing that in some parts of the world right now. We can actually restore fisheries through the effective management.
Absolutely. Do you think, first of all, that India can reduce its dependence on the imports from China, from Peru, and
I,
quickly become
I'd be
self-sufficient?
curious to look at what the import statistics are for India. I mean, one of the things we often look at for different parts of the world is so India produces fish meal, it imports fish meal, but also exports fish meal. So you have three different factors there. There's production plus import is the total fish meal available in India. But then you have to subtract export. And then what you can calculate what's called is effectively effective use. This is the actual disappearance or the net loss of that combined import and production that is not used, not exported. That is what we say is used internally in India. And I'd be interested to see that number because I am pretty certain that India is a net exporter of fish meal. It produces is like one of the largest fish meal producers in the world now, but it also exports more than it imports. Now, there's an opportunity in that situation for India to say, well, why don't we stop importing and just use what we've got? And the reason why that might happen the way it does is you might be importing fish meal and exporting more than you import, is because much of the Indian fish meal is high grade fish meal. So it has a very high value in the market. And the local market in India might go, well, we don't need that high grade. We're happy to buy some cheaper stuff from country X. and use that in our market. Therefore, they can trade the quality down. So that becomes an economic activity. So there's a net economic gain to India from that process. You're selling one fish meal at $2,000 a ton, and you're buying in another one that you're using at $1,500 a ton. So you're making a 25% margin there just on that transaction, for example. But the fact that you're selling a higher grade commodity and that commodity is getting a higher value in the market is because it's worth more, because it does better things. And again, those better things could be directed towards the Indian people rather than the Chinese people or whatever other market it's going to. And to me, that's part of that internal valuation story. I mean, I know India used to have an organization, I don't know if it still does, called MPEDA, the Marine Products Export Development Authority.
Yeah.
And that was obviously set up to basically encourage the development of export markets for fishery products, aquaculture products from India. I would hope that there's a similar such organization or authority in India, which is actually the domestic focus. How do we encourage our people to eat these products that are, sustainable and healthy and actually beneficial to our people, to prioritize feeding Indians first, and then sell your excess supply to your export markets. I was flying on an airplane the other day, and you might know, like when you get on an airplane, they do the, all right, this is how you put your life jacket on, the exits are here, this sort of the story. One of the things they talk a bit about was putting the face mask on. So if oxygen supplied or the cabin depressurizes, you put your oxygen mask on. And we probably all, anyone who's flying an airplane remembers this bit first, is that you put your mask on first before you put someone else's on second. Because it's pretty hard to put someone else's mask on if you're dead. Right? So you have to worry about your security first before you can help someone else. And to me, food security is the same thing. You shouldn't be exporting food to another country without looking after your own country first. And that to me is the Indian story, I think, is we need to, it's not just about total food supply, it's about total quality food supply. And to me, this is an opportunity India should be grasping with two hands and go, right, we're going to become the world's biggest producer of high grade Vanamai, and we're going to have a huge marketing plan in India to encourage everybody in India to have a shrimp meal once a week. It becomes the national dish is going to become shrimp, Indian shrimp. I think that would be a huge win for India, both economically, socially, culturally, and for the health of the people.
So that's where you were implying that let's increase the domestic consumption.
The issue we've had in the shrimp industry recent years is we've been oversupply and not enough demand. To me, if we grow the demand by increasing the demand by 1.4 billion people to say, I want my national Indian shrimp dish to eat this once a week, the demand will explode and India will never have a price supply issue ever again. Because what they'll have is if America or Europe wants to buy Indian shrimp, then they're going to pay a higher price than what the domestic market pays. Simple. So it just pushes the price up for everybody. And that makes it better for the shrimp farmers, better for the marine ingredient suppliers, better for India. The way to think about a FIP is to think of it like an insurance policy, okay? If you want to make sure that you never get into trouble in terms of you have a car accident or your house burns down, you have an insurance policy. A FIP is an effective management tool to make sure that the fishery that we are pulling resources from is effectively managed for everyone long term. So I see that the investment in a FIP is like paying an insurance policy to make sure that we don't lose this. Because if we ensure that we have this resource, it's well managed or even improved on, so we can maybe take more into the future from that resource if we better manage it, then that just means you can expand the shrimp farming industry in India, to be 1 million tons of shrimp rather than say 500,000 tons of shrimp. And with that growth, there's economic prosperity, there's more employment, there's better nutritional outcomes for India as well. And I just see that growing the demand also for marine ingredients. So I just see this as a win-win-win-win. As I said, look, I know Peter had a very strong push to develop export markets. I think that you need to spend the same amount of effort, if not more, on developing the domestic consumption in India than the export consumption. Because it's about how it's not just the economic return, it's the social welfare, the health return for the people of India. To me, there's a play here.
Absolutely. Your
This could be such a really good news story, I think. You know, if I was to ask you as an Indian, what would you say is the national food of India? What's the most popular food in India?
Oh no, that is not the right question. because because India is so big. India
Yeah,
is
it
so
is.
big. We have 28 to 30 dialects, right?
So, but I mean, each of the states are very different, and obviously, what you get in the north and
Right.
the south is very
Yeah.
different as well.
Great, great. And Brett, have you come to India before? Like, have
Yeah. I've been to Kerala, I've been to Goa, I've been to Chennai, I've been to New Delhi, I've been to Agra, I've been to Mumbai. No, I've been there for a few years. When did I last go there? I've not been there since COVID, so I have not been there in the last 5, 6 years.
and have we conducted any workshop here?
No, I haven't. No. I mean, I've had regular invitations. I've got lots of Indian friends. I really enjoy the company of Indians because I love the game of cricket. So
Okay.
it's always a good shared passion. I mean, I know the Indian people are very proud, passionate cricket supporters as well. Um, so I've not, yeah, I've had lots of invitations to come to India, but just haven't been able to find the time. I mean, I tend to travel 1 week and four these days, and most of those are usually to meetings in Europe. But I do get to Asia once or twice a year, Africa once or twice a year, Americas once or twice a year, and usually linked in with feed meetings or marine ingredient meetings. Um, so I've have to become increasingly discerning about what meetings I go to because I'm just running out of time because I've still got my work to do. And obviously, when you're traveling, you're not often doing your work; you're doing the communication part of your work.
Yeah, but I feel that if we should be doing a few workshops, every now and then, because your involvement will, of course, help this industry to get more regulated.
Yeah, look, again, it is. I said that I see the FIP story as like an insurance policy for the industry, and the more you can invest in that, the better the long term outcomes for that industry. And the aquaculture industry that relies on it. So, but you need all actors to engage and put personal interest aside and focused on what is the big outcome. If everyone collaborates, everyone can win. But if there's a couple of selfish actors who don't engage with thinking about the net outcome for everyone, just their own outcome, and play zero-sum games, then everybody loses.
Yeah.
So it has to be a really strongly managed by those who are managing the interest for everyone, which is why having it needs the fishing industry involved, it needs government involved, it needs the marine industry involved. There's all it needs the full supply chain there to actually harness the total benefit out of this process.
So, Brett, thank you so much for your wise words coming for India. I'm sure that you will see a lot of new things happening, a lot of progress happening in the years to come in terms of India focusing on increasing domestic consumption. Um, at the same time, making sure that we are reaching to different countries when it comes to exports. Um, Thank you so much for your kind words, Brett. So, any final words that you have that summarizes the gist of what we have covered so far?
No, nothing specifically really, other than I think we need to look at the marine ingredient story and the feed story um, as basically a long-term arrangement. We will always see variability in the short term, seasons, years. But if we take a focus on this story on a decadal time frame, 10, 20, 30 years, um, I think if we think about it in that way, we can build actually better arrangements to actually look for long-term resource security and long-term feed resource management strategies. And that's I think the mindset shift we need to engage with is that this is not about what we do this year. This is about what we do over the next 10 years.
Absolutely. And and when we spoke about fish meal and fish oil and other ingredients and the emergence of novel ingredients, you know. So according to me, we've had a very we've had a discussion in a very matured way. It's about asking the right system level question, right? That how do we fuel aquaculture growth when demand is rising faster than governance and climate stability and biology, for that matter, right?
And how do we make best use of the resources we have?
Oh, yes, yes. And fish meal and fish oil, of course, will remain nutritionally powerful, but they only deliver full chain when fisheries are responsibly managed,
Correct. Yeah,
supply chains are traceable, and price volatility is manageable. And then, of course,
absolutely.
there has to be more integrated approach when it comes to managing FIPS, because it needs active involvement of government, fish meal, fish oil, and feed mills. And then we can expand it to uh, having more outsider stakeholder consultation by bringing NGOs and other companies, right?
Great.
Uh, and of course, in markets like India, where FIPS traceability systems and governance are still catching up, diversification, I think, should not be the ideology. It should be risk management,
And
right?
and also adding to that story is that you, while you might have ambitions to basically end up with like a world-leading fisheries management program, uh, don't expect to get there straight away. You have to have a realistic expectations of the amount of effort and time people and resources people have to spend on doing these things. But in saying that, any effort you can make to better manage that resource with a focus on long-term security of supply and protection of the spawning stock biomass will come back with interest. It's an investment. Look at fisheries resource management is an investment,
Absolutely,
and we need to think of it that way.
absolutely. I think with that, we end our podcast today. Thank you so much,
No problem.
Brett. It was a lovely discussion
Yep.
with you, especially on a topic which is so complicated and at the same time so interesting and so innovative.
I mean, the thing is, we talked a bit about the FIP story and India going that journey. It has to be a journey that's led by India. India has to take, ownership and responsibility for initiating this and driving this. But there's many actors around the world who would be happy to help. But this requires it's India's fishery, needs Indian leadership. But I'm sure if they ask for help, there'll be many players in the world from countries like Peru, UK, USA, Australia, wherever who will happily help.
Great. Thank you so much.